The quarterly meeting had been scheduled for weeks, a showcase of numbers and projections meant to reassure Blackwood Financial's board that the empire was still steady. The mahogany-paneled conference room gleamed with polish, crystal glasses reflecting the gray rain streaking down the window panes. Graphs glowed on the massive screen at the front of the room, lines of profit and loss climbing and dipping like heart monitors. Executives leaned forward with pens poised, eyes flickering nervously to their CEO. But the sound that filled the room was not the click of laptops or the shuffle of papers. It was a child's cry, thin, high-pitched, and relentless. The wail knifed through the oak doors with such piercing insistence that even the most seasoned board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man tugged at his cufflinks, another pretended to reread a chart he had already memorized, but no one could ignore it. At the head of the table, James Blackwood sat rigid, his hands clenched so tightly on the polished surface that his knuckles paled. The billionaire who once silenced markets with a single phone call now found himself powerless against the sobs of a 6-year-old boy. His jaw worked, muscle tightening and relaxing, betraying the storm that the rest of his immaculate appearance tried to conceal. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," Elizabeth Carter, his chief financial officer, suggested gently. She glanced toward the door where the sound was loudest, sympathy softening her sharp features. James nodded once. 10 minutes. Chairs scraped back as the executives filed out, some whispering, others clutching their phones to check email with exaggerated purpose. James loosened his tie, the silk tugging at his throat like a noose, and pushed back from the table. Without a word, he strode down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The sea. Ryan grew louder as he neared the executive suite. Mrs. Thompson, the nurse, bent over his son's specialized wheelchair, whispering comforts that seemed to fall flat. Michael's face was crimson and wet, his small fists clenched, his body trembling with frustration. The wheelchair, a gleaming monument to tragedy, dwarfed him. "He's been inconsolable for over an hour," Mrs. Thompson admitted, her voice apologetic and frayed. "I've tried everything." James exhaled slowly, guilt pressing down on his chest. "It's okay," he murmured, forcing steadiness into his tone. "We'll reschedule the meeting." He crouched beside his son, lowering himself to eye level. "Hey, buddy, Dad's here." Michael didn't stop. His sobs rattled through him, each one tugging at the fracture lines inside James's heart. 2 years since the accident, 2 years since Sarah, 2 years of sterile silence broken only by his son's pain. He brushed a hand through his graying hair, searching for words that wouldn't come. A commotion rose at the reception desk, male voices sharp with authority. "Miss, you can't go in there, this is a private area." And then a blur darted past them. A small figure in a faded blue dress, honey blonde curls bouncing, sneakers scuffed from wear. She couldn't have been more than 7. She stopped in the doorway, defiant hazel eyes flicking to the crying boy. "He's hungry," she declared, her voice steady, carrying across the room with startling certainty. "That's why he's crying." James blinked, taken aback. "Who are you? How did you get up here?" The girl ignored him. She walked straight to Michael, dropped her worn backpack onto the floor, and knelt. "Hi, I'm Emma. You want to share my sandwich?" She unwrapped a crumpled square of wax paper to reveal a peanut butter sandwich, pressed slightly flat from being carried in her bag. She tore off a corner and held it up to Michael's lips. "My dad says food fixes everything." To James's astonishment, the sobs faltered. His son's chest hitched once, then stilled. He blinked through tears, focused on the girl, and opened his mouth. Emma placed the morsel gently between his lips. "See? Hungry," she said, as if the answer had been obvious all along. "My teacher says it's hard to think when your tummy's empty." Michael chewed, swallowed, and, miraculously, did not cry again. The silence in the room was fragile, a thin veil stretched across a storm. Even the security guard at the door hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. James remained kneeling, his eyes locked on Emma, the tilt of her nose, the lilt of her laugh as Michael reached for another bite, the way her hair caught the rain light from the window. Something about her stopped him cold. His chest tightened, his breath snagged. She looked like Sarah. Not exactly, but enough that for a disorienting second he could have sworn his late wife had returned in miniature, alive in this child. "What's your name again?" His voice was softer now, almost reverent. Emma Wilson." She never looked away from Michael, who had gone still, calm, his hand inching forward, grasping hers for the very first time that day. Emma smiled. "He has pretty eyes. They look sad, though." James felt the ice inside him fracture a little more. He hadn't seen that tiny hand move of its own accord in months. He glanced at the guard hovering in the doorway. The man raised a questioning brow. "Should I remove her?" James shook his head. Reply, no, leave her. He stood there, watching the two children, his son soothed not by his wealth, nor by medical expertise, nor by the nurse's careful hands, but by a stranger's simple act of kindness. The sandwich, crushed and humble, had worked a miracle that all his power and money could not. And in the glow of the rain-washed windows, with Emma's honey-blonde curls bent toward his son, James felt something he had not in a long time, the stirring ache of hope. The April rain had not stopped for 2 weeks, a steady drizzle that blurred the glass walls of the Blackwood estate and left the gardens outside slick with silver. Inside the sunroom, however, the world seemed warmer, brighter, even alive. Paper cranes dangled from the ceiling beams cut by small, uneven hands. Crayon drawings of castles, dragons, and sunflowers bloomed across the walls where once there had only been bare, immaculate paint. Emma Wilson sat cross-legged on the wide window seat, a battered storybook open across her lap, her honey-blonde curls tumbling forward as she lowered her voice to a gravelly growl. And then the dragon said, "I'm not scary, I'm just hungry," she roared in her tiny voice, holding up a green crayon like a sword. Michael's shoulders shook, not with sobs this time, but with laughter. A sound James had not heard in 2 long years spilled from his son's chest, soft at first, then bubbling until it filled the room. He sat in his chair beside Emma, one hand resting against the tray, his eyes bright with something dangerously close to joy. From the doorway, James watched, coffee cooling in his hand. He couldn't look away. The world's most powerful men had sat before him earlier, pitching numbers and neat bullet points, but it was this little girl with her wrinkled sandwich bag and scraped knees who had done the impossible. "She brings something out in him that none of us can," James murmured. Mrs. Thompson, the nurse, nodded softly, her eyes misting. "His therapist says he's more responsive. It's remarkable." James swallowed hard, his throat constricting. Remarkable. That was the word Dr. Winters had used as well. The boy who had refused food, who stared through people as though they were glass, was eating, smiling, even moving because of her. And then there was the resemblance. Those hazel eyes, the faintly tilted nose, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated. For an instant, it was Sarah in miniature, sitting there, coaxing laughter out of Michael with nothing but kindness. James felt that same haunting crack in the armor he had built since the accident, the one that let grief seep in like water through stone. He was still staring when a deep voice broke his trance. "Mr. Blackwood." James turned sharply. Robert Wilson stood in the hall, work clothes damp from the rain, a tool belt slung low at his waist. His posture was stiff, as though the air in the room were too fine for him. "I finished with the upstairs bathroom fixtures," Robert said quietly. "All good now." "Thank you, Robert," James replied, forcing warmth into his voice. He extended a hand. "And please, it's James." Robert shook it briefly, rough calluses against boardroom soft skin. His eyes darted to Emma. "She hasn't been any trouble, has she?" "Quite the opposite." James glanced back at the children. "She's remarkable with Michael." Robert's hardened expression eased just enough to reveal a man used to carrying too much weight. "She's got a way about her. Always has." His jaw tightened. "But I don't want her bothering your boy. She's just a kid." James hesitated, hearing the sharpness in Robert's voice, feeling its echo in his own chest. "She's not bothering him," he said quickly. Too quickly. "In fact, I was hoping we could make an arrangement. Michael's doctors believe Emma's presence is, well, it's helping him in ways we didn't think possible. Would you consider letting her visit regularly? I'd, of course, compensate you both." Robert stiffened. "We don't need charity, Mr. James." His voice was calm, but there was iron in it. "I fix things for a living. I don't sell my daughter's company." James's face flushed with shame. He had built an empire on transactions, but this child wasn't a commodity. "You're right," he admitted, the words tasting of humility he wasn't used to. "I haven't been transparent. But Robert," Michael smiled today. He laughed. "For the first time in 2 years. That's not charity. That's life coming back." A sudden crash split the air. Both men rushed back into the sunroom. A vase lay shattered on the marble floor, water pooling across the rug. Emma stood frozen, guilt clouding her small features. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Mikey wanted to see the flowers closer. When I tried to move them—" "It's fine, sweetheart," Robert said, already crouching to sop up the spill with his handkerchief. "Please, let the staff handle it," James started, but Robert cut him off. "We clean up our own messes," he said, not meeting James's eyes. Michael's face crumpled, tears threatening. For months, the smallest disruption had sent him spiraling into panic. But before James could speak, Emma dropped to her knees and caught his trembling hands. "Hey, it's just water," she said, voice bright with childish certainty. "Remember in the book? when the dragon knocked over the knight's castle? Sometimes accidents happen. It doesn't mean everything's broken forever. Michael blinked at her, lips parted. Slowly, his breathing steadied. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. His finger twitched toward the spilled flowers. James felt his heart twist. It wasn't just her face. It was her timing, her instinct, the way she knew what Michael needed before anyone else did. The board could whisper, his father could judge, but in that moment, James understood something simple and terrifying. Emma was the key. And perhaps, just perhaps, the sandwich wasn't an accident at all. The Blackwood estate had not echoed with such life in years. Where silence had once wrapped around its gilded halls like a shroud, there was now laughter spilling from corners, crayons scattered across Persian rugs, and the sound of a little girl's sneakers squeaking against marble floors. The house was breathing again, and James Blackwood, once the embodiment of steel discipline, found himself disoriented by the warmth of it. He stood at the French doors that opened onto the garden, coffee cup trembling in his hand, and watched Emma Wilson pump her legs on the newly installed swing. Robert was behind her, pushing with careful steadiness, his workman's palms flat against the ropes. Each push drew a peal of laughter from Emma, a bright trill that floated through the cold air like birdsong. Beside James, Michael sat in his wheelchair, his head tilted back, eyes fixed on Emma as she flew higher and higher. The boy's lips parted. "Higher," he whispered, his voice fragile but clear. It was the first word James had heard him speak in days. He nearly dropped the coffee cup. Emma twisted on the swing to look at Michael, beaming. "See? He likes it. He wants me to go hati." "Sure." She leaned forward, her curls bouncing in the wind. "Don't worry, Mikey, I won't fall, I promise." James's throat closed. Mikey. Sarah had always called him that. Never Michael, always Mikey. James had never told the girl, not once, and he knew Robert hadn't either. The nickname had been a private thing, whispered in the nursery before bedtime. And yet here it was, resurrected in the mouth of a child who looked uncannily like his late wife. Mrs. Thompson's quiet voice drew him back inside. "Sir, Dr. Matthews says Michael's reflexes are improving. He actually initiated movement yesterday. Voluntary movement." Her eyes flicked toward Emma. "He may never regain full mobility, but she's reaching him in ways we didn't think possible." James nodded, though his mind churned. Was this luck, coincidence, or something stranger, something that rationality could not pin down? The question lingered in him like a splinter. That evening, after Emma had gone home with her father, James found himself walking through the garden. The roses his late wife Sarah had planted had long been left to wither, their brittle stems blackened by neglect. But tonight, a fresh cluster of blooms had been pruned and revived. Robert had been at work here. The air smelled of wet earth and faint sweetness. James felt torn. Guilt gnawed at him for wanting what perhaps was not his to have. The next morning he invited Robert into his study. The contractor stood near the shelves of leather-bound ledgers as though they might bite. His broad hands were clasped, shoulders taut. "I'd like to make an arrangement," James began carefully. "Michael's doctors believe Emma's presence is helping him. I'd like her to come here regularly. We could, well, I'd pay you both, of course." Robert's face hardened instantly. "We don't need your money, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not raising my daughter to be someone's charity project." James flushed, the truth of the rebuke cutting him. He had spent decades reducing people to transactions, numbers on a spreadsheet. He opened his mouth to protest, but a sudden crash shattered the conversation. They rushed back into the sunroom. A porcelain vase lay broken, water spreading across the marble like a dark map. Emma stood frozen, her tiny fists clenched. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Mikey wanted to see the flowers. I thought I could move them, but—" "It's all right, sweetheart," Robert said, dropping to his knees, blotting the water with his handkerchief. His movements were quick, almost frantic, as if cleaning the mess would erase the embarrassment of being the servant in another man's home. James reached for the bell to summon staff, but Robert stopped him with a low voice. "We clean up our own messes." For a moment, their eyes met. Two fathers bound by grief, pride, and something neither wanted to name. Michael's face began to twist again, tears threatening to return. James felt the panic rise in him. He didn't know what to do, not anymore. But Emma did. She crouched in front of Michael's wheelchair, her small voice steady and oddly commanding. "It's just water, no big deal. Remember the story? When the dragon knocked over the knight's castle? Sometimes accidents happen. Doesn't mean the fun is over." Michael blinked at her. His breathing slowed, then with visible effort, his right index finger twitched toward the crumpled paper sunflower lying near the spill. James felt his heart stop. For 2 years, Michael had barely moved that hand, had never used it to point. Now, in Emma's presence, he was reaching, literally reaching, for something. In the corner of his eye, James caught the security guard, still lingering, for once he didn't care about appearances. He waved the man away, his voice quiet but firm. "She stays." Emma picked up the paper flower and placed it gently on Michael's lap. He clutched it with trembling fingers, his watery eyes fixed on hers. James stood in silence, a billionaire undone not by loss this time, but by the fragile possibility that hope had just walked into his life wearing a faded blue dress and carrying a squashed sandwich. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the years of silence and sorrow, something long dormant began to stir awake. The late summer sun had begun to wane, its glow softened by the thickening clouds that hung over Boston like a shroud. In the garden behind the Blackwood estate, the therapeutic pool shimmered an inviting turquoise, steam curling faintly from its heated surface. The water was Emma's idea. "Mikey can't walk, but he can swim like a merboy," she had told James with such conviction that he found himself ordering a custom hydraulic lift and pool rails before the week was out. Now, 6-year-old Michael floated in the water with a supportive harness, his legs stiff but no longer wholly lifeless. His therapist, Dr. Matthews, hovered nearby with a clipboard, calling out encouragements. Robert waded in waist-deep, his shirt sleeves rolled, guiding his daughter as she splashed alongside Michael, coaxing him to move his arms and push against the resistance of the water. "Kick, Mikey!" Emma shouted, her little hands cutting through the water like paddles. Michael's lips parted, his body shifted, then, slow, deliberate, his right foot twitched. James, standing on the terrace, gasped so hard he nearly dropped his glass. Dr. Matthews' jaw fell open. "There," the therapist whispered. "Did you see that? He initiated the movement." Emma squealed with joy. "I told you, he's strong like a superhero." She leaned toward Michael. "One day I'll race me across the pool. You'll win, I bet." Michael gave a small, breathy laugh, his eyes glued to her face. James felt his chest tighten, hope again, sharp and terrifying, like light cutting through darkness. He pressed a hand to the doorframe, steadying himself. "Sarah, if you can see this." But the moment shattered. Michael slipped sideways in his harness, his body tilting at an angle. Before anyone could react, he slid beneath the water. The sound of Emma's scream ripped through the humid air. "Dad!" she shrieked. "Help him!" Robert lunged, plunging his arms beneath the surface, yanking Michael up. The boy's face was pale, lips tinged with blue, his chest unmoving. Water streamed from his mouth. Emma, shivering on the pool's edge, sobbed so hard she could barely breathe. I tried to hold him," she cried. "He's too heavy, I couldn't." Dr. Matthews was already on the ground, pressing his hands against Michael's tiny chest. 1, 2, 3. He counted under his breath, forcing rhythm into the boy's body. James stumbled forward, his heart hammering as if it would burst. "Michael!" James shouted. He knelt, gripping his son's cold hand, willing it to twitch again. His world contracted to the shallow, rattling breaths that refused to come. Emma pressed her palm against Michael's other hand. Her eyes closed. Her lips moved in a whisper only he could hear. For a terrifying stretch of seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a violent cough, Michael's chest convulsed and water spewed from his mouth. His small body shook, but air returned. The monitors beeped back to life. Robert exhaled with a sob, pressing his forehead to his son's damp hair. Emma clung to both of them, her own tears mixing with the pool water still dripping from Michael's skin. James felt his knees weaken, relief and terror colliding until he had to brace himself on the marble floor. The ambulance arrived in a whirl of flashing red and white. Parsaran. A medic swept in with brisk efficiency, lifting Michael from the tiles and strapping him onto a gurney. His eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, but his fingers never released Emma's hand. "Take care of her," James said hoarsely, looking at Robert as they wheeled Michael toward the waiting vehicle. "I'll ride with him. You stay with Emma." Robert's jaw worked, pride and fear battling in his expression. He nodded once. "We'll follow right behind." The siren wailed as the ambulance tore into the gray Boston streets. James sat inside, clutching Michael's hand, staring at the boy's pale face as the oxygen mask hissed softly. He remembered Sarah's last moments, her pale lips, her hands slipping from his grasp. A flash of memory, her whispering, "Take care of our little one." He had thought she meant Michael. Hours later, in the sterile glow of Boston Children's Hospital, James listened as the doctor explained the situation. Aspiration pneumonia, complicated but manageable. Michael was stable, though fragile. James closed his eyes, the weight of relief dragging him down like an anchor. When Robert and Emma finally entered, the girl's fever-bright cheeks startled him. She looked exhausted, but her eyes locked instantly on Michael's bed. She pressed her tiny hand to his, and the boy stirred, as though her touch had tugged him back from the brink. "He's dreaming," Emma whispered softly, leaning close, "about the water. But he's not scared anymore." The lady with the yellow hair told him it wasn't time yet. James's heart lurched. Harold, who had been silent in the corner, looked up sharply. Robert froze mid-step, the flowers he had brought from the estate trembling in his hands. James could not find words. His throat closed, the sound of rain and the steady beep of the monitor filling the silence. Emma's eyes, solemn and far too old for her years, lifted to James. "She says she's here, you know. She's helping both of us." And for the first time, James could no longer tell whether the weight in his chest was grief or the beginnings of a miracle he wasn't sure he deserved. The first frost came quietly, stitching silver threads across the garden beds where Sarah's roses had once wilted. Now, under Robert's care, they bloomed again, their petals defiantly bright against the shortening days. James stood on the terrace one morning, steam rising from his coffee, and felt something he had not felt in years. The estate was alive. Children's chalk drawings spread across the stone pathway like a mural, a forgotten teddy bear perched on the banister, and from the pool house came the sound of splashing water, punctuated by Emma's voice carrying on the autumn air like music. "Kick, Mikey, kick! Pretend you're an astronaut floating in space!" James turned to see his son in the water, strapped into the floating harness. The boy's face was alight with concentration, tongue poking out between his lips. His legs, once limp as if carved from marble, trembled. A toe twitched. Then a foot pushed weakly against the water. The splash was small, but to James, it was an earthquake. "His core strength is improving," Dr. Matthews said from the pool's edge, excitement breaking through her professional tone. "He initiated that movement himself." James felt Robert's presence beside him. The contractor's calloused hands were wet from the pool water, his shirt clinging to his chest. But his eyes were softer now, almost luminous, as he watched his daughter guide Michael through the water with gentle authority. "She told me to pretend I'm swimming too," Emma said, beaming as Michael's laugh bubbled up from behind the mask. "Mermaids can't walk, but they're strong. You'll be strong too," James's throat closed. The way she spoke, simple, unwavering, yet carrying the weight of wisdom no child her age should possess. It tore open the sealed vault inside him where he had locked away Sarah's memory. He could almost hear his wife's voice and Emma's laugh. He wanted to believe it was coincidence. He needed to. That evening, the fire in the study threw shadows that stretched long across the Persian rug. Robert sat stiff-backed in one of the leather chairs, a tumbler of scotch untouched in his hand. His eyes were fixed on the flames. "Michael's school called again," James said, pacing before the hearth. "They want to know when he'll return. He's keeping up academically with the tutor, but socially—" "Emma's school called me too," Robert interrupted, his voice low. "They're concerned. She's been missing classes. And when she does go, she tells stories about Sarah, stories about things she can't possibly know. Yesterday, she told her teacher that Sarah used to sing to Mikey about sunflowers. The teacher asked me if Emma's been seeing a therapist." James froze. He had never told Robert about Sarah's obsession with sunflowers, the way she planted them in clusters outside Michael's bedroom window, insisting they were little beacons of light he could wake to. "What did you tell her?" James asked. Robert gave a hollow laugh. "What could I say? That my daughter remembers a woman she never met? That she sometimes speaks in a voice that isn't hers? I told them we had an unusual family arrangement, left it at that." James lowered himself into the chair opposite, his expression unreadable. The fire snapped and hissed. "We could look into private schools, somewhere more flexible, somewhere that would understand." Robert shook his head, jaw set. "That's not the issue. What is this, James? We've been here for months now. I fix your house, Emma spends her days with Michael, and we sit here like—" He broke off, searching for the word. "Like some stitched-together family. But what are we, really? Employer and employee? Friends? Co-parents? And when your board demands all your time back, what then? What happens to Emma? To me?" The questions landed heavy, a truth James had been avoiding. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "I don't know. All I know is that Michael is alive in ways he hasn't been since Sarah. And Emma is the reason. You're part of that, Robert. You've become—" He stopped himself, unable to finish. The air between them thickened, heavy with words unspoken. Then came the sound, not laughter this time, but a sharp cry from upstairs, high-pitched and raw. Emma's voice followed, trembling. "Dad, Mikey's scared." They raced up the staircase. Michael sat upright in his bed, eyes wide, his tiny hands shaking. Tears streaked his cheeks. "I saw it," he whispered when James sat beside him. "I saw the crash. Mommy tried to turn the wheel. She tried." His chest heaved, and his voice broke into sobs. James froze. Michael hadn't been in the car that night. He had been at home with the nanny when the accident happened. He couldn't have seen it. Emma appeared at the doorway in her pajamas, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Her curls were tangled, her eyes fever-bright but steady. "He's right," she said simply. "I saw it too. I saw the crash. I saw the lady with the yellow hair." The room went still. Robert turned toward his daughter, his face pale, his voice hoarse. "Emma, how would you know that?" Emma tilted her head, the motion uncannily familiar, like Sarah concentrating over a medical chart. "Because Mikey showed me, not with words, in my head. And then she came. The sunflower lady, she said it wasn't time yet." James felt a cold shock ripple through him, a truth he wasn't ready to hold. Across from him, Harold Blackwood stood rigid in the doorway, his lined face grave, his eyes locked on the little girl. "This child," Harold said slowly, voice quieter than James had ever heard it, "is more than we understand. And if she's part of your son's healing, we must ask ourselves why." Emma, oblivious to the weight pressing down on the adults, climbed into Michael's bed and pressed her tiny palm over his. "I told you, Mikey. She's still here. She's watching us." Michael's trembling stopped, his lips curved upward, and for the second time in weeks, he laughed. The sound was soft but sure. James's breath hitched as his father's eyes flicked toward him, filled with something James had never seen before, not disapproval, but fear. The house, once frozen in grief, now hummed with life, and yet, beneath the laughter of children and the glow of the fire, a darker question stirred like a shadow in the corner. What if Emma wasn't just a visitor, but something far more entwined with their lives than any of them had dared admit? Snow fell in soft, deliberate silence, blanketing the Blackwood estate in a layer of white that glowed beneath the lanterns. The garden, once abandoned, then revived, now looked like a living memory. Sarah's roses dusted with frost, the sunflowers Emma had insisted on planting standing stiff and defiant against the cold. Their golden faces leaned toward the faint winter sun, stubbornly seeking light in the darkness. Inside the grand library, the fire snapped in the hearth, its warmth spilling across Persian rugs and carved wood paneling. A towering Christmas tree stood in the corner, dripping with silver tinsel and hundreds of glass ornaments that reflected the fire's glow in fractured shards. Emma, wrapped in a red sweater a size too big, stood on tiptoe at the edge of a stool, clutching a sunflower ornament she had crafted from yellow paper. Her tongue poked from the corner of her mouth as she stretched. "Mikey," she called, balancing precariously. "Where should it go?" Michael, strapped into his wheelchair, raised his trembling hand. He pointed, first uncertainly, then with greater intent, toward a bare branch just beneath the star. "There," he whispered. His voice cracked, but it carried. "Got it." Emma smiled, and for a heartbeat James saw Sarah standing there instead, her hair gleaming gold in the firelight, her eyes wide and knowing. Robert was already moving to lift Emma, his strong arms steadying her as though she were made of porcelain. He held her aloft and she placed the sunflower delicately in the chosen spot. When he set her down, she clapped her hands, cheeks flushed pink from the fire's glow. "Perfect," Michael said softly. His face was pale but lit with a pride that seemed to radiate warmth into the coldest corners of the room. James blinked against the tears rising unbidden. Harold, standing a few paces away, cleared his throat, the sound rougher than usual. "Sarah would be proud," he murmured. James nodded, swallowing hard. "She would, wouldn't she?" But as if to answer, Emma turned from the tree, her expression suddenly shifting, her hazel eyes darkening with an intensity too old for her face. She looked directly at James. "The sunflower lady says this is just the beginning," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "She says sometimes miracles look like accidents." The words struck James like a physical blow. His breath caught in his chest. The sunflower lady. Emma had spoken of her before, but now, with the tree's golden light haloing her curls, the resemblance to Sarah was terrifying. It wasn't just the eyes or the smile, it was the cadence, the echo of Sarah's own phrases, the exact way she used to speak when comforting Michael before bedtime. Before James could respond, a chime echoed through the house. The butler entered holding a thick, weathered envelope sealed in red wax. "A courier just delivered this, sir, from Boston General Hospital." James's stomach turned cold. He had nearly forgotten. Weeks earlier, after Emma's collapse, he had quietly requested Sarah's old medical files and cross-referenced them with Emma's birth records. He hadn't dared open the results. Not yet. "Dad," Harold said quietly, watching him, "it's time." James's hands shook as he slit the seal. Pages slid free, rustling faintly like brittle leaves. Medical charts, lab reports, then a DNA analysis, clinical and merciless in its precision. His eyes darted over the numbers, the probabilities, the conclusions stamped in bold type. Probability of biological relation, 99.98%. James froze. The world tilted. The fire seemed to roar louder, drowning out every sound but his own heartbeat. Emma with Sarah's eyes, Sarah's smile, Sarah's sunflower songs, was his daughter. His and Sarah's. The embryo they thought had been lost in the chaos of IVF, implanted in another woman. He looked up. Robert was staring at him, waiting, shoulders stiff with dread. "Tell me," Robert said, his voice tight. "What does it say?" James's lips parted, but no words came. The truth pressed against his chest like a weight that could crush him if he dared release it. He looked at Emma, who now stood between Michael's wheelchair and her father, her small hands slipping into each of theirs, binding them together. She studied him with those impossible hazel eyes, eyes that held both childhood innocence and something far older, something that saw straight through him. "It's okay," she said softly. "I already know. The sunflower lady told me." James staggered back, the report slipping from his hands to the floor. Harold bent, picked it up, scanned it, and exhaled a long, broken breath. For the first time, the iron mask of the Blackwood patriarch cracked, and his eyes shone wet in the firelight. Robert looked down at his daughter, and then at James. Pain and love wrestled in his face, but his hand did not loosen around Emma's. "She's mine," he said, voice low, steady. "And she's yours. But she's mine too. You'll have to accept that." James stepped forward, his voice raw. "I don't want to take her from you. I don't want to lose her again." Emma looked between them both, her small hands squeezing tighter. "Then don't," she whispered. "We can all be together. That's what she wants." The room fell into a silence heavy with snowlight and fire glow, broken only by Michael's soft, steady breathing. For the first time in 2 years, James did not feel the void of Sarah's absence pressing him down. Instead, he felt something shift. Fragile, impossible, but real. Perhaps Harold was right. Perhaps the world would never fully explain what Emma was. But as James knelt beside his son and drew both children into his arms, he heard Sarah's voice, not as memory, but as presence. Sometimes families are born. Sometimes they find each other. And for the first time, James allowed himself to believe it.